I was 4 hours into my shift when I found the campsite. The problem was, the campground had been closed for 3 weeks, and I'd locked the gates myself. But someone, or something, had set up a tent from 1977, built a fire that burned without heat, and left no footprints in the mud. That was the first night I understood that Washington's forests don't forget the people who enter them, and sometimes they don't let them leave. Welcome to Verified Fears. Tonight, I'm bringing you 11 cases from people who encountered things in Washington's parks and forests that shattered everything they thought they knew about the wilderness. These aren't campfire tales or urban legends passed down through generations. These are first-hand accounts from rangers, hikers, maintenance workers, and families who went into the woods and came back changed. Some barely made it out. Others left pieces of themselves behind. Each story comes from a different corner of Washington's vast wilderness. From the moss-covered rainforests of the Olympic Peninsula to the volcanic slopes of the Cascades. From isolated fire lookout towers to popular trails where thousands hike every year. What you're about to hear spans different seasons, different terrain, and different kinds of terror. But they all share one thing. The people who lived through these experiences can't explain what happened to them, and they've never fully recovered. Before we begin, do me a favor. If these stories give you that hollow feeling in your chest, that sense that maybe you felt watched in the woods too, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel exists because of people like you who understand that some experiences can't be rationalized away, and that the wilderness holds secrets we're not meant to understand. Drop a comment if you've ever experienced something unexplainable in the outdoors. Your story might be next. And if you make it to the end of all 11 accounts tonight, you're tougher than most. Let's see if you can handle what these forests are hiding. I need you to understand something before I tell you this. I've worked in forestry surveying for 12 years. I've mapped thousands of acres across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. I don't get lost. I carry 3 different navigation systems. I mark my routes obsessively. And I pride myself on being the guy who always knows exactly where he is. That's why what happened to me in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest last November still doesn't make sense, and why I'm only now finding the courage to talk about it. I was doing a routine timber assessment in a remote section near the old logging roads, about 30 miles southeast of Mount St. Helens. It was late autumn, and the fog was rolling through those clear-cut areas the way it does when the temperature drops. Heavy, thick fog that smells like wet bark and rotting leaves. I was alone, which is standard for this kind of work. The company sends you coordinates, you hike in, you assess the timber quality, you hike out. Simple. I'd done it 100 times before. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was checking my GPS for the next coordinate point when I noticed a service road on the screen that I hadn't seen on my printed maps that morning. It led almost directly to where I needed to go, which would save me about an hour of bushwhacking through dense second growth. I remember feeling grateful, actually. Grateful that someone had updated the GPS maps with this old logging road. I turned onto it without a second thought. The road was overgrown but passable. Just 2 tire ruts with grass growing up the middle. Nothing unusual about that. These old logging roads crisscrossed the entire forest, most of them abandoned since the 80s. But as I walked, I started noticing little details that felt off. The road was narrower than it should have been, like it was slowly being squeezed by the forest on both sides. The trees were leaning in at angles that didn't look natural. And there was this smell, this weird chemical smell mixed with pine, like old diesel fuel and something else I couldn't identify. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I passed a mile marker post. It said 0.0. I thought that was strange, but I kept going. 15 minutes later, I passed another mile marker. 0.0. Same post, same number. I stopped and pulled out my GPS. According to the screen, I'd traveled nearly a mile. I looked behind me, trying to see the first marker through the fog. But the road just disappeared into gray nothing. That's when I started to feel it. That cold weight in your stomach when you know something is very wrong, but your brain hasn't caught up yet. I kept walking because turning back felt wrong somehow, like the road wouldn't let me. And that's when I saw my boot prints in the mud ahead of me. Not behind me, where they should have been. Ahead of me. Fresh prints, exactly matching my boots, the same tread pattern, the same wear on the right heel where I drag it slightly. I was following my own footprints, but I hadn't walked this section yet. My hands started shaking. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything. The road, the markers, my prints. I checked the photos immediately, and here's what made my blood turn to ice. In the background of the first photo, there was a road sign I hadn't noticed when I'd taken the picture. It was weathered and old, but I could read it clearly on my phone screen. It said, Service Road 447, decommissioned 2031. I took that photo in November 2024. I started walking faster, trying to find my truck, trying to get off this road. But the geometry was wrong. I'd see my truck through the trees on my left, the white paint visible through the fog, and I'd push through the underbrush toward it. And somehow, I'd end up back on the road with the truck now visible on my right. It was like the forest was folding around me, keeping me on this loop no matter which direction I tried to break away. The panic was setting in hard now. I was breathing fast, my vision was tunneling, and I kept checking my GPS, but the screen was looping too. The little blue dot that represented me kept tracing the same spiral pattern, tighter and tighter, like water circling a drain. I looked at my photos again, and the road signs in my pictures were changing. The same photos I'd taken 20 minutes ago now showed different signs, different numbers, different warnings I knew I hadn't seen when I'd pressed the shutter. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. I stopped trusting anything. The road, the GPS, my own tracks, my own eyes. I picked a direction that felt wrong, that my brain was screaming at me not to take. And I crashed through the underbrush like a wounded animal. Branches tore at my face. Blackberry thorns shredded my forestry vest, and I didn't care. I just pushed through the densest, most miserable terrain I could find, going perpendicular to everything that felt right. And then I was standing on Highway 25, just suddenly there, stumbling out of the tree line onto asphalt like I'd passed through a membrane. There was a logging truck coming around the bend, and the driver had to brake hard. He pulled over, probably thinking I was injured or crazy, and I must have looked like hell. Torn clothes, bleeding scratches all over my arms and face, gasping for air. He asked if I needed an ambulance. I told him no. I told him I'd gotten turned around. He looked at me like he didn't believe me, but didn't want to ask questions. Here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. My truck was parked at a trailhead 17 miles south of where I came out. 17 miles. I'd only walked at most 2 miles into the forest before I'd found that road. There is no physical way I could have covered that distance in the 5 hours I was out there. And most of that time, I was walking in what I thought was a tight loop. When I finally got back to my truck and checked the printed maps, there was no service road 447. I called the Forest Service office and asked about it specifically. They told me no road by that designation has ever existed in that section of Gifford Pinchot. I asked about roads scheduled for decommissioning in the future. They said they don't plan that far ahead. I still work in forestry, but I won't take solo assessment jobs anymore. I carry paper maps, GPS, a compass, and a satellite phone, and I check all of them obsessively every 15 minutes. My coworkers think I've developed some kind of anxiety disorder. Maybe I have. But I've also stopped trusting maps completely. Because I learned something that day that I can't unlearn. Sometimes the forest makes its own roads, and if you follow them, you might end up somewhere that isn't on any map at all, or maybe somewhere that isn't meant to exist yet. And I think about that date on the sign every single day. 2031, 7 years from when I saw it. What was I walking toward? I'm going to tell you about the worst mistake I ever made as a father. And I need you to understand that I live with it every single day. My daughter is 19 now, and she still won't go camping. She won't even sleep with her window open. And it's my fault. Because I didn't listen to her when she was 8 years old and trying to tell me that something in the forest wanted to take her away. This happened in July, about 11 years ago. My wife and I decided to take the kids camping at Copper Creek Campground up on the Mountain Loop Highway in the North Cascades. It's a beautiful spot right by the water, surrounded by old-growth forest. We'd been there before. It felt safe, familiar. We got a site that backed up against the woods, which I thought was perfect because it felt private, secluded. The campground was only half full that week. There had been wildfires to the east, and you could smell smoke in the air, even though the fires were miles away. The light had that weird orange quality it gets when there's ash in the atmosphere. Our daughter Emma started talking about her new friend on the second night. She was 8, imaginative, always making up games and stories. So when she mentioned that a girl lived in the forest behind our tent and wanted to play, we smiled and nodded. Kids say things like that. My son Michael was 11, more serious, and he rolled his eyes at his sister's imaginary friend. My wife and I exchanged that knowing parent look. We thought it was cute. But Emma kept talking about her. She'd stand at the edge of our campsite, right where the forest started, and have these long conversations with the trees. She said the girl's name was Sarah, and that she was cold. She said Sarah wore a yellow jacket, but it was torn, and that her eyes were the wrong color. I remember asking Emma what she meant by that, and she thought about it very seriously before saying, "They're not dead eyes, but they're not alive eyes either." I laughed it off. I told her she had quite an imagination. I wish I'd paid attention to the way my wife's smile faded when Emma said that. On the third night, Michael came into our tent around 2 in the morning. He was shaking, and he wouldn't look at us. He crawled into his sleeping bag between me and my wife and whispered that he'd gotten up to use the bathroom, and he'd seen someone standing in the trees behind our tent. A girl, he said, just standing there between 2 big Douglas firs, perfectly still, watching our campsite. He said she was wearing a dirty yellow jacket, and her hair was matted and wrong. He said when he'd shined his flashlight on her, she didn't blink or move or react at all. She just stared at him with eyes that reflected the light, like an animal's. I told him he'd seen a deer or maybe another camper's kid who couldn't sleep. But I could tell by the way his jaw was clenched that he didn't believe me. And honestly, I'm not sure I believed myself. There was something about the way both kids had described that yellow jacket. The same detail, unprompted. That's when my wife reminded me that Emma had been talking about a girl in the forest for 2 days. and Michael had never heard those conversations because he'd been off exploring with kids from another campsite. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. All around our tent, in the dirt and pine needles, there were small handprints, child-sized, muddy, pressed into the ground. They circled the entire tent. I counted them. There were over 30 handprints, like someone had crawled around our tent on their hands and knees in the middle of the night, just inches from where we'd been sleeping. The prints were small, maybe the size of an 8 or 9-year-old's hands. I stood there staring at them while my coffee got cold, and I couldn't think of a single rational explanation that made sense. I should have packed us up right then. I should have loaded the car and driven home and never looked back. But I didn't want to scare the kids or ruin the trip over what I kept trying to convince myself was just another camper's child playing a weird game. So I scraped dirt over the handprints with my boot and didn't tell anyone what I'd found. That night, Emma sat straight up in her sleeping bag at around 3 in the morning and said, "Sarah says it's my turn now." Her eyes were open, but she wasn't awake. She was sleepwalking, and she was crawling toward the tent zipper with this horrible mechanical movement, like someone was pulling her by strings. My wife grabbed her, and Emma fought against her with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a little girl. She was whispering things I couldn't quite hear, instructions or directions, and her voice didn't sound like her voice. I unzipped the tent to see what she was trying to reach, and I saw her, the girl in the yellow jacket. She was standing maybe 20 feet away, right at the edge of where our tent's light reached the forest. She was small, child-sized, with long, dark hair hanging in front of her face. Her jacket was torn and filthy, and underneath it, her clothes looked old-fashioned, like something from decades ago. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there, and even though I couldn't see her eyes through her hair, I could feel her looking at Emma, looking at my daughter with an intensity that made every nerve in my body scream. I did something then that I've never told anyone, not even my wife. I stepped out of the tent and I walked toward that thing. I don't know why. Anger, maybe. Protective instinct. I got within 10 feet of her, close enough to see that her skin was the wrong color, too gray, too waxy. Close enough to see that her yellow jacket had a name tag sewn on it, the kind they used to put on kids' clothes in the 70s and 80s. Close enough to read the name, Sarah Veneman. She tilted her head at me, and her hair shifted just enough that I could see her eyes. They were black, completely black, like someone had pressed holes into her face. And then she smiled, and her teeth were too sharp, and there were too many of them. I ran back to the tent. We packed everything in 15 minutes, stuffing gear into bags and bins and not caring about the mess. Emma was screaming that we couldn't leave, that Sarah would be mad, that Sarah would follow us home. Michael was crying silently, his face white. My wife was praying under her breath, and she's not religious. We left our tent stakes in the ground. We left half our gear. We drove out of that campground at 4 in the morning with our headlights cutting through fog so thick it felt like driving through milk. 3 weeks later, I went to the library and started searching missing persons reports for that area. I found her. Sarah Veneman, age 9, disappeared from Copper Creek Campground in August 1994 during a family camping trip. Last seen wearing a yellow raincoat, never found. The photo in the article showed a smiling girl with dark hair and a yellow jacket, and I recognized her immediately. My daughter is 19 now, and she has scars from this that will never heal. She has nightmares about a girl in a yellow jacket standing outside her window. My son doesn't like to talk about that trip. But sometimes, I catch him staring into dark spaces with this haunted expression that breaks my heart. My wife and I almost divorced over it because she blamed me for not leaving sooner, for not listening, and she was right to blame me. I'm telling you this because I need other parents to understand something. If your child tells you they've made a friend in the woods, if they start describing someone who shouldn't be there, believe them. Don't dismiss it as imagination. Don't laugh it off. Because some things that live in the forest aren't alive anymore. And they remember what it was like to be a child. And they want that feeling back so desperately that they'll try to take it from your kids. We never went back to Copper Creek. But sometimes I think about Sarah Veneman standing at the edge of the firelight, waiting for a playmate. And I wonder how many other families she's visited. I wonder if she's still there, still wearing that yellow jacket, still looking for someone to take her turn. I used to think I understood how the world worked. I have a degree in wildlife biology. I've spent years studying animal behavior, predator-prey relationships, evolutionary adaptation. I believed in observable phenomena, in data, in rational explanations for everything. I was the person who rolled my eyes at ghost stories and supernatural claims. I was the skeptic in every conversation, the one who'd explain away every strange occurrence with logic and science. I'm not that person anymore. Last August, I went backpacking alone in the Hoh Rainforest in Olympic National Park. If you've never been, it's one of those places that doesn't feel like the rest of America. Everything is green, impossibly green, covered in moss and lichen that hangs from the trees like something from another world. The Sitka spruce trees are ancient and massive, their branches twisted and reaching. The forest floor is soft with centuries of decomposition, and it's quiet in a way that city people don't understand. The moss absorbs sound. Rain falls constantly, but it's muffled, gentle. You can hear your own heartbeat in that silence. I hiked in about 6 miles on the Hoh River Trail and set up camp near 5 Mile Island, right by the water. It was perfect. I had my permit, my bear canister, all my gear properly organized. I've done solo trips dozens of times. I prefer them, actually. There's something meditative about being alone in the wilderness, about having nothing but your own thoughts and the sound of the river. Or at least, that's what I used to think. The first time I heard my name, it was around sunset on my second day. I was filtering water from the river when I heard it clearly. Carried through the trees, Michelle, my mother's voice. Exact pitch, exact tone, the way she used to call me in for dinner when I was a child. I looked up, expecting to see another hiker, maybe someone who coincidentally sounded like my mom. But there was no one. The trail was empty in both directions. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded flat and small in all that moss and dampness. Nothing. Just the river and the wind in the high branches. I went back to filtering water, telling myself it was just the wind, just the acoustics of the forest playing tricks. But my hands were shaking slightly as I screwed the cap onto my water bottle. An hour later, I heard it again. "Michelle, honey." Closer this time. Definitely my mother's voice, with that particular inflection she uses, that subtle concern mixed with affection. I stood up from my camp stove where I was cooking dinner and walked toward the sound. "Mom," I said, and I heard how ridiculous that was, even as the word left my mouth. My mother was in Seattle, 200 miles away. But the voice was so perfect, so exactly right, that some irrational part of my brain believed she might somehow be here. "Michelle, come here." The voice came from deeper in the forest, off the trail. I stopped walking. Something in my gut told me not to follow it, not to leave the trail. I stood there in the fading light, listening to the river, and I heard my name again. But this time, it was my grandmother's voice. My grandmother, who died when I was 15. "Michelle, darling, I've been waiting for you." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I backed toward my tent, not taking my eyes off the forest. And that's when I heard the third voice. My ex-boyfriend, David. We'd broken up 2 years ago, badly, and I hadn't spoken to him since. But I heard his voice, clear as anything. "You never should have left me, Michelle. You made a mistake." That's when I understood that something was very, very wrong. These weren't coincidences or acoustic anomalies. Something in the forest was using voices I knew, voices I trusted, and it was trying to lure me away from my camp. I grabbed my phone and put on music, turning the volume up as loud as it would go. Pop music, meaningless and human and real. I needed to drown out those voices. I sat in my tent with my headphones on, playing song after song, and I could still hear them underneath the music. Multiple voices now, overlapping, calling my name. My mother, my grandmother, my ex, my best friend from college, my thesis advisor. People living and dead all calling to me from the darkness beyond my tent. But it wasn't just that they were using these voices. It's what they were saying. They knew things, private things, memories I'd never shared with anyone. My grandmother's voice told me about the time I'd stolen money from her purse when I was 12, something I'd never confessed to anyone. David's voice repeated something I'd said during our last fight, something cruel that I'd regretted ever since, but had never told another living soul. The voices were reaching into my head somehow, pulling out my memories, my shame, my secrets, and reflecting them back at me. I want you to imagine what that feels like. To hear the most intimate parts of your consciousness spoken aloud by voices you love and trust. To have your own mind turned against you. I felt violated in a way I can't properly describe. It wasn't just fear. It was the sickening realization that my thoughts, my private self, wasn't private at all. Something could see inside me. The voices continued through the night. They moved around my tent in a circle, sometimes close, sometimes distant. They changed tactics. They begged. They threatened. My mother's voice crying, pleading with me to help her, saying she was lost and cold and needed me. My grandmother's voice turning angry, disappointed, saying I'd always been a selfish child. David's voice becoming aggressive, accusatory. And underneath it all, I could hear something else. A kind of breathing that wasn't quite breathing. A sound like wind through hollow tubes. I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent with my headlamp on, my bear spray in one hand and my knife in the other, and I sang out loud to myself. Stupid songs, children's songs, anything to keep my own voice in my ears instead of those other voices. I watched my tent walls, expecting any moment to see a handprint press against the fabric from outside. But nothing touched the tent. Nothing physical, anyway. Around 3 a.m, the voices began speaking in unison. All of them together, same words, same rhythm. "We know you, Michelle. We see you, Michelle. We're inside you, Michelle." Over and over, a chorus of every voice I'd ever loved, speaking as one entity. And then they started saying things I was thinking in real time. I'd think, "This isn't real." And immediately all the voices would whisper, "This isn't real." I'd think, "I need to leave at first light." And they'd echo, "You need to leave at first light." They were in my head, reading my thoughts as I formed them. That's when I started screaming. just screaming, wordless and raw, to fill my head with sound that was mine, that I controlled. I screamed until my throat was ragged, and the voices laughed. Actually laughed in perfect synchronization with the laugh of every person I'd ever known. At dawn, I didn't pack properly. I threw things in my backpack, left my tent stakes in the ground, abandoned my bear canister because I couldn't get it open with my shaking hands. I hiked out in record time, practically running, and the voices followed me for the first 2 miles. They stayed just behind me, just out of sight. And they were saying things now that I'd never told anyone because I'd never said them out loud. Private thoughts about people I knew. Cruel observations, petty jealousies, all my worst interior moments being broadcast back to me in the voices of people I cared about. And then, about 4 miles from the trailhead, they stopped. Complete silence. Even the normal forest sounds seemed muted. I stood there on the trail, breathing hard, waiting. And then I heard it. A whisper, so close it felt like lips against my ear. "We'll be here when you come back, Michelle. We'll always be here. We know where to find you now." I ran the rest of the way out. I got to my car, threw my pack in the back, and drove away without even stopping at the ranger station to turn in my permit properly. I drove all the way to Seattle without stopping, and I've never been back. Here's the part that terrifies me most. The part that makes me question my sanity and keeps me awake at night. Sometimes, in my apartment in the city, with all my doors locked and my windows closed, I hear whispers, just at the edge of perception. My name, spoken in voices I recognize. It's faint, and I can almost convince myself it's my imagination or the sound of neighbors through the walls. But I know those voices. I know the exact tone of my mother saying my name. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear it. I don't backpack anymore. I can't. The thought of being in the wilderness, surrounded by trees and silence, fills me with a panic so intense I can barely breathe. I've seen 3 different therapists, and none of them can explain what happened to me. Auditory hallucinations, they say. Stress-induced psychosis, isolation anxiety. They give me clinical terms and suggest medication. But I've done the research. I've found other reports, scattered across forums and hiking websites. People who heard voices in Olympic National Park. People who heard their names called in voices they recognized. People who felt something reading their thoughts. Most of them don't give details. They just say they left and never went back. I'm a scientist. I was trained to observe and document and explain. But I can't explain this. I can't rationalize it or fit it into any framework I understand. Something lives in that rainforest, something that can reach into your mind and pull out everything you are. It can wear the voices of people you love like a mask. It knows you better than you know yourself. And I think it's still watching me. Even here, even now, hundreds of miles away. Because sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see something move behind my reflection. Sometimes I hear my own voice speaking words I'm not saying. And I wonder if it didn't just read my mind that night in the forest. I wonder if it took something, a piece of me, a memory, a thought, a part of my consciousness that I'll never get back. I'm telling you this as a warning. If you go into the deep places, the old forests where the moss grows thick and the silence is absolute, and you hear someone calling your name in a voice you recognize, don't answer. Don't follow it. Don't even acknowledge it. Because once it knows you've heard it, once it knows it has your attention, it will find everything inside you that you've ever tried to hide. and it will never let you go. They say isolation does things to your mind. They say if you spend too much time alone in the wilderness, you start seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that don't exist. That's what the Forest Service supervisor told me when I tried to explain what happened during my 3rd week at the lookout tower. He smiled in that patronizing way people do when they think you're cracking under pressure, and he suggested I take a few days off, maybe talk to someone. But I know what I saw. I know what climbed those stairs. And I have the photos to prove it, even if no one wants to look at them. My name is Chris, and last summer I took a job as a fire lookout in the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest. I was 22, just finished my junior year studying environmental science, and the idea of spending 3 months alone in a tower watching for wildfires sounded like a dream. Romantic, you know? Just me, my books, the mountains, and complete silence. I'd applied for the position because I wanted solitude. I wanted to prove I could handle it, that I was more mature and independent than my friends who were spending their summer partying and working retail jobs. The lookout is a 14 by 14-foot cabin perched on top of a 70-foot steel tower. You access it by climbing metal stairs that wrap around the tower's central support structure. The cabin is basically one room with windows on all sides, a small cot, a propane stove, some shelves, and the Osborne firefinder in the center. That's the device you use to triangulate the location of smoke. No running water. No electricity except for a small solar panel that charges your radio and phone. The nearest road is 6 miles away. During fire season, you're up there alone for 10-day shifts. Then you get a few days off. The first 2 weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. Peaceful. I'd wake up with the sunrise, make coffee on the propane stove, spend my days reading and scanning the horizons for smoke. I saw 3 lightning strikes spark small fires that I reported, and I felt useful, important. The nights were cold, even in July, and I'd watch the stars through the windows and feel like I was floating above the world. I'd never been happier. Week 3 started normally enough. My supervisor radioed to check in, dropped off supplies at the trail access point, and told me there were reports of increased bear activity in the area. Standard stuff. That first night of the 3rd week, I was reading by headlamp around 10 o'clock when I heard something move in the trees below the tower. I figured it was a deer or maybe one of those bears they'd mentioned. I shined my spotlight down into the forest, sweeping it across the tree line, but I didn't see anything. Just darkness and the silver reflection of eyes that could have belonged to any number of animals. I went back to reading, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching the tower. You know that sensation, right? When the hair on the back of your neck stands up and your body knows something your brain hasn't processed yet. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see something, but there was only my own reflection staring back at me. The next night, I saw it clearly. I was using the binoculars to check a distant ridge where I thought I'd seen a heat shimmer earlier in the day. And when I panned across the clearing at the base of my tower, I caught 2 eyes reflecting in the moonlight. They were too high off the ground to be a deer, too wide set to be a bear, and they were looking directly up at the cabin. I watched for maybe 30 seconds, and those eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just stared. I grabbed the Osborne firefinder, not to look for fires, but to use it as a reference tool. The firefinder has degree markings that let you pinpoint locations. I marked where those eyes were. 240 degrees, approximately 80 yards from the tower base. Then I made dinner, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. An hour later, I checked again with the binoculars. The eyes were at 310 degrees now, 70-degree change in position. Whatever it was had moved around the tower in the time I'd been cooking. Over the next 4 nights, I tracked it. Every night, it appeared at the tree line at a different compass point. It was circling the tower, observing from different angles. And each night, it was getting closer. I measured the distances using landmarks I'd memorized during my first weeks. 80 yards became 60 yards, 60 became 40. By the 5th night of week 3, it was standing at the base of my tower stairs. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my cot with my headlamp off, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the first metallic sound. A soft scraping, like something dragging across steel. It took me a few seconds to identify what I was hearing. Something was on the stairs. Something was climbing. The stairs wrap around the tower in a spiral, and they're made of steel grating, the kind you can see through. They're loud when you walk on them. Every step produces a sharp clang that echoes. But whatever was climbing wasn't making walking sounds. It was making dragging sounds, scraping sounds, like it was pulling itself up using the railings or the stairs themselves. I grabbed my spotlight and pointed it down the stairwell that leads into my cabin. The cabin door was locked. I'd checked it 3 times. But there's a small gap at the bottom, maybe half an inch. And through that gap I could see the metal grating of the landing just outside my door. I could see shadows moving across it. Something was right outside, on my landing, separated from me by a door and a simple deadbolt lock. Then I heard breathing. Heavy, wet breathing, like something with fluid in its lungs. It was right against my door, and I could hear it sniffing along the crack where the door met the frame. Long, deliberate inhalations, like it was trying to smell me, trying to identify what was inside. I want you to understand the layout here. I was 70 feet in the air, at the top of a tower in the middle of nowhere, with something breathing outside my only exit. There was no back door, no alternative escape route. If that thing got through my door, I had nowhere to go except out the windows, and that was a 70-foot drop onto rock and scrub. I braced myself against the door, pressing my shoulder and back against it, and I waited. The door handle turned. Slowly, deliberately, testing. When it didn't open, the breathing got louder, more agitated. Then came the scratching. Not gentle scratching, aggressive gouging, like metal on metal. Whatever was out there had claws or something sharp, and it was dragging them across my door, down the frame, across the hinges. This went on for 3 hours. I timed it on my watch. 3 hours of breathing, scratching, the door handle turning periodically, and weight shifting on the landing that made the entire tower structure creak and sway slightly. I didn't move from that door. My legs went numb, my back cramped, but I didn't move. At dawn, around 5:30, when the first light started filtering through my windows, it stopped. Just suddenly went silent. I waited another 30 minutes before I got the courage to look through the small window in my door. The landing was empty. Nothing there. But when I finally unlocked the door and opened it, I saw what it had left behind. The metal stairs were gouged. Deep scratches, 4 parallel lines, carved into the steel like someone had taken a chisel to it. The railing was bent in places, twisted like something had gripped it with enormous force. And the door frame of my cabin was scored with claw marks that went through the paint and into the metal underneath. I took pictures of everything. I documented it obsessively because I knew no one would believe me otherwise. Then I radioed dispatch. I told them I'd had a bear incident and needed someone to come up. The dispatcher said they'd send someone within 48 hours, that bear encounters were common and I should just secure my food and make noise to scare it off. I didn't tell them that bears don't climb 70-foot towers and scratch metal stairs. That day, I didn't see anything unusual. I watched the tree line constantly, scanning with binoculars, but nothing appeared. I felt exhausted, paranoid, and completely isolated. I kept thinking about the fact that I had 6 more nights before my scheduled days off. 6 more nights alone up here with whatever that thing was. The second night, it came back. Same pattern. Scraping on the stairs, breathing outside my door, the handle turning. But this time, I heard something else. Tapping on the windows. All around the cabin, on every side. Something was tapping on the glass. Not aggressive banging, just soft, persistent tapping. Like it was testing each window to see which one was weakest. I shined my spotlight at the windows, and for just a second, I saw a hand. Not a paw, not a claw, a hand. But the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, and the skin looked dark and rough, almost bark-like. I screamed at it, I don't know why. Maybe to assert some kind of control, to prove I wasn't completely paralyzed with fear. I screamed, "Get away from here! Leave me alone!" And the tapping stopped. Complete silence. Then, from right outside my door, I heard something that still gives me nightmares. It mimicked my voice. Not perfectly, but close enough. It said, "Get away from here," in a voice that sounded almost like mine, but distorted, like someone had recorded me and played it back through damaged speakers. I didn't sleep at all that night or the next. By the 4th night of these encounters, I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I was seeing movement in every shadow, hearing sounds that weren't there. Or maybe they were there, and I just couldn't tell the difference anymore. That night, it didn't climb the stairs. Instead, I heard it on the roof. The cabin roof is just thin metal, and I could hear every step, every shift of weight. It walked in circles above me, around and around. And I sat on my cot, staring at the ceiling, expecting any moment to see claws punch through the metal. But it didn't break through. It just walked in circles for hours, and then, just before dawn, it left. I heard it descend the tower stairs, and when I looked out the window, I saw something moving away through the trees. It was upright, bipedal, but it moved wrong. Its gait was too long, too loping. It disappeared into the forest, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. When my supervisor came to resupply me 2 days later, I showed him the claw marks, the bent railing, the scratches on my door frame. He examined them and said it looked like a bear trying to get into the cabin. I asked him how a bear climbs stairs and scratches steel, and he just shrugged and said they're stronger than people think. I showed him my photos, the clear handprint marks on my window from the condensation. He said it was probably just my own handprints that I'd forgotten about. I finished my contract because I'm stubborn and I needed the money. But I never felt safe again. The thing came back twice more during my time there, always during the 3rd week of each 10-day cycle, like it had learned my schedule. The last time I saw it clearly was 3 days before my contract ended. It was standing at the tree line in broad daylight, and I got a good look through binoculars. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, covered in dark hair or bark, I couldn't tell which. And its face was wrong. Too elongated, eyes too far apart, mouth that seemed to split its face horizontally almost to its ears. I don't work for the Forest Service anymore. I changed my major. I work in an office now, surrounded by people and noise and artificial light. I can't handle isolation anymore, can't handle silence. And I think about the next person who took that fire lookout position. Wonder if it visited them too. Wonder if they heard the scratching on the stairs and the breathing outside the door. Because whatever lives in that forest, whatever territory that tower sits in, it doesn't want us there. And it will climb 70 feet of steel stairs to make that clear. There are some mistakes you can't take back. Some lines you cross that change you permanently, and no amount of apology or ritual can make you whole again. I've spent my entire life respecting the land, honoring the old ways my grandfather taught me, understanding that some places demand reverence, whether you believe in spirits or not. And in one careless moment, I violated something sacred, and it nearly cost me everything. My name is Thomas. I'm Yakima, 43 years old, and I've worked as a hunting and fishing guide in Washington for over 20 years. I know these mountains like I know my own hands. I know which valleys hold elk in September, which streams run with steelhead in November, which ridges catch the morning thermals for hawks. I was raised to understand that the land isn't just terrain. It's alive, it has memory, and it watches. My grandfather told me stories that I half believed as a kid. Stories about places where the veil was thin, where offerings were made, where you didn't trespass without permission. I thought I understood. I thought I was careful. Last September, I was guiding a wealthy client on a backcountry fishing trip near the Lake Chelan Sawtooth Wilderness. We'd hiked into a remote alpine lake, one of those places that requires a hard scramble and good orienteering to reach. The client was staying at the established campsite near the shore, and I was doing my usual routine of scouting the area, checking for hazards, finding the best casting spots for the next morning. The air was crisp with that first hint of fall. The aspens were turning gold, and there was fresh snow dusting the peaks above us. It was perfect, peaceful. I was walking along the north shore, maybe a quarter-mile from our camp, when I found the clearing. It was just off the trail, set back about 30 yards into a grove of old pines. The trees formed a natural circle around it, and in the center was a ring of stones. Not random stones, deliberately placed, uniform in size, arranged in a perfect circle about 15 feet in diameter. Each stone was smooth and dark, river rock probably, and they were spaced exactly the same distance apart. The moment I saw it, something in my gut told me this was intentional, ceremonial. This was a place that had been made for a purpose. I should have left immediately. I should have turned around, marked the location on my GPS, and never gone back. But I was curious. I stepped into the circle, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I could see my breath suddenly, even though it was probably 60 degrees outside the circle. The ground inside was bare earth, no grass or pine needles, just dark soil that looked recently disturbed. And scattered around the inside edge of the circle were offerings. There were wilted wildflowers, still relatively fresh, coins, blackened with age, but clearly deliberate placements, small carved pieces of wood, showing symbols I didn't recognize, a braided cord made of what looked like horsehair. These weren't ancient artifacts. Some of them were recent, maybe days old. Someone was actively using this site. Someone was still making offerings here. I photographed everything. That was my first mistake. I documented the circle, the stones, the offerings, treating it like an interesting anthropological find instead of what it actually was. A active sacred site that I had no business entering. And then I made my second, unforgivable mistake. There was a small stone at the edge of the circle, about the size of a silver dollar, perfectly smooth and dark, with a natural hole worn through its center. It was beautiful. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand, felt the weight of it. Without really thinking, I put it in my pocket. The moment that stone settled in my pocket, I felt wrong. Not guilty, though I should have felt guilty, but physically wrong, like I'd swallowed something that my body was rejecting. My stomach cramped, my mouth went dry, and I had this overwhelming urge to put the stone back. But I was already walking away from the clearing, already telling myself it was just a stone, that no one would miss it, that I'd found it and finders keepers. I can't explain why I kept it. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. Or maybe I'd already crossed the line and something wanted me to keep it, wanted me to carry it away. I got back to camp and cooked dinner for my client. We ate by the lake as the sun set, and everything seemed normal. But as darkness fell, I noticed the water. Alpine lakes are usually still at night, maybe some ripples from wind, but mostly calm and glass-like. This lake was moving, not waves exactly, but a rhythmic rise and fall, like breathing. The entire surface would swell up maybe 6 inches, then recede, then swell again. Breathing. The lake was breathing. My client didn't notice. He was in his tent, already asleep, exhausted from the hike in. But I sat by the fire, watching that water rise and fall, and I knew something was wrong. I pulled the stone from my pocket and held it up to the firelight, and I swear it was warm. Not from being in my pocket, actually warm like it had its own heat source. I should have thrown it in the lake right then. I should have hiked back to that clearing in the dark and returned it. But I didn't. I put it back in my pocket and told myself I was being irrational, that I was letting old superstitions get into my head. Around midnight, I heard the rocks. All along the shoreline, I could hear stones clicking together underwater, like someone was down there knocking them together rhythmically. Click, 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 click. A pattern deliberate and constant. I shined my flashlight across the water, and in the beam, I could see the surface still rising and falling with that breathing rhythm, and I could see shapes just beneath the surface. Dark shapes, vertical, standing in the shallows. I counted 7 of them. 7 figures standing in water that was maybe 3 feet deep, perfectly still except for the movement of the water around them. They were humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too thin. Proportions that didn't match human anatomy. And they were all facing my camp, all facing me. Just standing there in the breathing water, watching. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire all night, keeping it built up. And those figures never moved. They just stood there in the shallows, and the water kept breathing, and the stones kept clicking together below the surface. When dawn came, they were gone. The water was still. The clicking had stopped. But I felt exhausted, hollowed out, like something had been draining me all night. My client and I fished that morning. He caught 3 cutthroat trout and was thrilled. But I couldn't focus. I kept feeling the stone in my pocket, kept feeling watched from the water. Every time I looked at the lake, I saw ripples where there shouldn't be ripples, movement just below the surface. And I kept thinking about my grandfather's stories, about places where offerings were required, where disrespect was punished, where taking something sacred meant you owed a debt. That night was worse. The figures came back, but this time there were more of them. Maybe 20, all standing in the shallows, forming a semicircle around our camp. The water breathed harder, the swells bigger, and the clicking stones were louder, more aggressive. And I started to hear voices, not English, not Sahaptin, not any language I recognized. Just sounds that felt like words, rising from the water, overlapping and echoing. My client finally noticed. He came out of his tent around 2 a.m., asking what that sound was, asking if I heard the voices. I told him it was probably wind through the rocks, but I could see in his face that he didn't believe me. He asked if we could leave in the morning, cut the trip short. I agreed immediately, but I knew leaving wouldn't solve anything. I knew I'd taken something, and whatever owned that stone wanted it back. More than that, they wanted acknowledgement. They wanted me to understand what I'd done. At dawn, before we broke camp, I told my client I needed to scout the trail ahead and I'd be back in an hour. I hiked to that clearing, to the ring of stones, and this time the temperature drop hit me like a wall. It was freezing inside that circle. Frost on the ground, even though it was September and warming up outside. The offerings I'd seen before were gone. All of them. Just bare earth and the ring of stones. I pulled the stone from my pocket and placed it back exactly where I'd found it. And then I did something I hadn't done since I was a kid. Something my grandfather taught me, but I'd thought was just tradition, just symbolic. I pulled out the small pouch of tobacco I always carry for offerings, though I'd gotten lazy about making them. And I placed a pinch in the center of the circle. I spoke in Sahaptin, words my grandfather taught me, asking for forgiveness, acknowledging my disrespect, offering tobacco in exchange for my transgression. The moment I finished speaking, the temperature normalized, just instantly warm again, normal September mountain air. And I felt it, that sick, wrong feeling I'd been carrying since I took the stone just released. Like a pressure valve opening. I could breathe fully again. I hiked back to camp, and we packed out that day. The lake was calm, normal, no breathing water or clicking stones. My client asked me once what had really been happening, and I told him some places have their own rules, and we'd accidentally camped somewhere we weren't welcome. He didn't push for more explanation. But here's what haunts me. About a week later, I was guiding another client in a completely different area, maybe 80 miles from that lake. We were camped in a valley, miles from any water. And in the middle of the night, I heard it. The clicking stones. That same rhythmic pattern echoing through the forest around our tent. I got up, stepped outside, and in the moonlight, I could see frost on the ground in a circle around our camp. Even though it was still warm enough that my breath wasn't fogging. They'd followed me, or they'd marked me. I don't know which is worse. I finished that trip, but I haven't guided in that region since. I tell clients I'm booked, or that access is restricted, or I suggest different areas. I can't go back there. And sometimes, late at night in my own house in Yakima, I hear those stones clicking. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. I'll be sitting in my living room, watching TV or reading, and I'll hear it. Click, click, click. A reminder that I violated something, and even though I tried to make it right, some debts aren't fully paid, with tobacco and apology. My grandfather told me that some places don't belong to us, that they're doorways or anchors for things we don't understand. He told me that offerings aren't just tradition, they're protection, they're respect. They're a way of acknowledging that we're guests in territories that predate us by thousands of years. I thought I understood that. I thought I was being respectful just by knowing the stories. But knowing isn't the same as believing. And respecting isn't the same as understanding. I took something from a place of power, and that place made sure I learned the difference. I'm telling you this because if you hike into the backcountry, into the old places where the forest feels different and the air tastes strange, and you find stones arranged in patterns or offerings left by unseen hands, don't touch them. Don't photograph them. Don't even step into those circles. Acknowledge them, respect them, and walk away. Because some places will forgive a transgression if you make it right. But they'll never forget. And they'll never let you forget either. I've been a volunteer with King County Search and Rescue for 7 years. I've found lost hikers, recovered bodies, rappelled down cliffs in the dark, and performed CPR on hypothermic patients miles from the nearest road. I've seen people at their absolute worst and their most desperate, and I've learned to stay calm in situations that would make most people panic. They train us to be methodical, to follow protocols, to trust our equipment and our team. They train us to believe that if we do everything right, we'll bring people home safely. But they don't train you for the moments when reality breaks. When your GPS shows you somewhere you couldn't possibly be. When time stops making sense. When you lose 4 hours of your life and can't account for a single minute of it. They don't have protocols for that. And they definitely don't tell you what to do when you realize you might have failed someone because you can't remember what happened to you. My name is Rebecca, and I need to tell you about a search and rescue mission at Mount Rainier last February that ended my career. Not because I quit, though I should have, but because I can't trust myself anymore. I can't trust my memory, my perception, or my ability to stay present in reality when it matters most. We got the call at 4:30 in the afternoon on a Friday. A solo hiker, male, 36 years old, had failed to return from a day hike in the Paradise area of Mount Rainier National Park. His car was still in the lot, and he'd told the ranger station he'd be back by 2 p.m. It was February, so we were dealing with deep snow, limited daylight, and temperatures that would drop below zero after sunset. This was urgent. In winter conditions, exposure can kill you in hours. I was assigned to Team 3, searching Grid Sector C, which covered a section of the Skyline Trail and the surrounding terrain. There were 5 of us on my team initially, but we split up to cover more ground, each taking a subsection with the understanding that we'd maintain radio contact and check in every 15 minutes. Standard procedure. I'd done this dozens of times. My subsection was a steep, forested slope below the main trail, the kind of area where someone might have slipped off the path or tried to take a shortcut. I had my radio, my GPS, my avalanche beacon, my probe pole, my first aid kit, everything by the book. It was 5:45 p.m. when I started my section, and the light was already failing. I clicked on my headlamp and started working my way through the snow, calling out the hiker's name, looking for tracks or disturbed snow or any sign of passage. At 5:52, according to my GPS log, I radioed in my first check. Everything normal. No sign of the subject, continuing search pattern. My team leader acknowledged, told me to keep checking in. At 6:07, I was supposed to radio in again. I remember reaching for my radio. I remember pressing the button. And then I was standing in a completely different location. I don't mean I walked somewhere and forgot the walk. I mean, I blinked. And the forest around me was different. The trees were wrong, the slope angle was wrong, the snow depth was wrong. I looked down at my GPS, and my position showed me at a coordinate that was 6 miles from where I'd just been. 6 miles, in what felt like seconds. My first thought was that my GPS was malfunctioning. I checked it, reset it, waited for it to recalibrate. Same position. I pulled out my phone as a backup. Same coordinates. I was 6 miles northeast of my search sector, in terrain I'd never been assigned to cover, with absolutely no memory of how I'd gotten there. I tried my radio. Static. I cycled through all the frequencies we were using, nothing but white noise. I checked my watch. It said 9:43 p.m. I'd lost 4 hours. 4 hours I couldn't account for. The last thing I clearly remembered was pressing my radio button at 6:07 to check in. And now it was nearly 10 at night, and I was miles from where I should be. I want you to understand what this felt like. It wasn't like waking up from sleep or coming out of a daydream. There was no grogginess, no transition. One moment I was in my search grid reaching for my radio. The next moment I was somewhere else entirely with 4 hours gone. My headlamp batteries were significantly drained. My boots were packed with snow that had partially melted and refrozen, meaning I'd been walking for a while. My legs were tired, the kind of deep muscle fatigue you get from sustained climbing. But I had zero memory of any of it. I started reviewing my GPS track log, hoping it would tell me where I'd been. What I saw made my hands start shaking. The track showed me moving in a straight line from my search sector to my current position. But the line went through terrain that's impossible to traverse. The GPS track cut straight through cliff faces. It crossed a frozen river that I would have needed technical climbing gear to descend to and ascend from. It went through areas of steep avalanche terrain that would have killed me if I'd triggered a slide. The line on my GPS was geometrically straight, like I'd been pulled through the landscape by a cable, ignoring all physical obstacles. I pulled out my helmet cam. We all wear them on searches, protocol for documentation and safety. I rewound the footage to 6:07, where my memory stopped. The video showed me reaching for my radio, pressing the button. Then the video glitched, pixelated, went to static. When it cleared, the timestamp jumped to 9:38. There were 5 minutes of footage showing me standing still in a completely different location. Just looking around in obvious confusion, before I'd apparently checked my GPS and realized something was wrong. But between 6:07 and 9:38, there was nothing. Just digital noise and fragmented frames that showed darkness and movement, but nothing coherent. I tried to hike back to the search area, but I was disoriented, exhausted, and frankly terrified. I knew I had to get back to base, had to report in, but I also knew I couldn't explain what had happened. How could I? I'd somehow traveled 6 miles through impossible terrain with no memory of it. And my GPS and camera both showed corrupted data that defied explanation. It took me until nearly midnight to navigate back to the Paradise parking lot where our base was set up. By the time I stumbled into the lights and the organized chaos of the search operation, everyone was looking for me too. My team leader grabbed me, checked me over for injuries, demanded to know where I'd been. I told him my radio had failed and I'd gotten disoriented. He asked why I'd left my search sector. I said I wasn't sure, that I'd thought I'd seen something and pursued it. He told me they'd already searched my sector with another team. They'd found nothing. And here's the part that still makes me feel sick. They'd found the missing hiker's body at 7:15 p.m., about 200 yards from where I'd been searching. He'd fallen into a tree well, a depression in the snow around the base of a tree, and had died of hypothermia. They estimated time of death around 5 p.m., before I'd even started searching my sector. But I have a clear memory, not from the missing hours, but from before, of searching that area. I remember walking past that exact tree. I remember looking at that tree because it was a big Douglas fir with heavy snow accumulation around its base, exactly the kind of tree that creates wells. I remember consciously scanning it and seeing nothing unusual. But the body was there. The recovery team confirmed it. He'd been there the whole time, and I'd walked right past him. At the debriefing, I submitted my GPS log and helmet cam footage. The search coordinator looked at the GPS track, looked at me, and asked if I'd fallen and hit my head. I said I didn't think so. He asked if I'd taken any medications. I said no. He told me gently that the data showed an impossible route and suggested I get checked out by a doctor. He didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. Something was wrong with me, not with the data. I went to my doctor. I got a full neurological workup. MRI, blood tests, cognitive assessments. Everything came back normal. No signs of stroke, no tumors, no seizure activity, nothing that would explain a 4-hour fugue state. My doctor suggested extreme stress, possible dissociation, recommended therapy. But I've experienced stress before. I've had bad days, exhausting searches, traumatic recoveries. I've never lost time like this. I've never had my equipment malfunction in synchronized ways. I've never walked through cliff faces, at least not according to any GPS I trust. The worst part, the part that keeps me awake, is wondering what happened during those 4 hours. Where was I? What did I see? Did I find something I wasn't supposed to find? Did something find me? And most horrifying, was the hiker already dead when I started searching? Or was he still alive during those missing hours, calling for help while I was somewhere else, doing something I can't remember? I reviewed the coroner's report obsessively. Time of death estimated between 4 and 6 p.m., with the caveat that cold conditions make precise timing difficult. So maybe he died before I even arrived. Or maybe he was still alive at 5:50 when I was searching nearby. And he died during those 4 hours when I was gone, when I could have found him if I'd been where I was supposed to be. I still volunteer with search and rescue, but I'm not allowed on solo assignments anymore. My team leader doesn't say it explicitly, but I can tell they're watching me, worried I'll disappear again or make another inexplicable navigation error. Some of my teammates think I had a mental breakdown. Others avoid talking about it entirely. One person, a veteran SAR member who's been doing this for 20 years, pulled me aside after a training session and told me quietly that he'd heard stories about Mount Rainier, about people losing time, about the mountain doing things to your head. He said some places have their own gravity, their own rules, and sometimes they pull you into something you're not equipped to understand. I don't know if I believe that. I want to believe there's a rational explanation. Equipment failure, neurological anomaly, some medical condition they haven't detected yet. But I've watched that helmet cam footage 100 times. I've studied the GPS track until I've memorized every coordinate. And I can't escape the fact that for 4 hours, I was somewhere else. Maybe somewhere physical, maybe somewhere that doesn't show up on maps. And whatever happened during that time, whatever I did or saw or experienced, my brain decided it was better if I didn't remember. I think about the hiker sometimes. His name was David. He had a wife and 2 kids. He was an experienced mountaineer who made one small mistake. Probably stepped too close to a tree well, fell in, couldn't get out. A random tragedy, the kind we see too often in winter conditions. But I can't stop wondering if I could have saved him if I'd been where I was supposed to be. If those 4 hours hadn't been taken from me. And I wonder if whatever took them might take more next time. If I'll lose another 4 hours or 4 days. or if one day I'll step into the forest and never come back at all. With nothing left behind but a GPS track that goes nowhere and footage that shows only static. They tell you search and rescue is about bringing people home. But no one tells you what to do when you can't even find yourself. You think you know a place when you've been there 100 times. You think familiarity equals safety, that routine trails can't surprise you anymore. I run the same route every week, the same 3.6 miles up to Rattlesnake Ledge and back, and I could do it blindfolded. I know every switchback, every route that crosses the path, every spot where the view opens up to show the mountains. It's my meditation, my therapy, my escape from the noise of Seattle. Or it was, until the day the trail decided to show me something I wasn't supposed to see. I'm not the kind of person who believes in paranormal stuff. I'm a software engineer. I deal in logic and code, and I've always had explanations for weird experiences other people treat as supernatural. Sleep paralysis, not ghosts. Pareidolia, not faces in the darkness. The brain playing tricks, not reality bending. That's who I was before this happened. Now, I don't know what I believe, except that our reality might be thinner than we think. And sometimes you can slip through the cracks into something else entirely. This was a Tuesday in April, about 8 months ago. I'd left work early, driven out to the Rattlesnake Ledge trailhead like I do twice a week. It was overcast, but not raining. Typical spring weather for Western Washington. The parking lot was half full, which is actually light for that trail. It's one of the most popular day hikes near Seattle. So you're constantly passing other hikers, hearing conversations, seeing dogs and families, and trail runners like me. It's not a place where you feel isolated or alone. That's part of why I like it. I started my run at 4:30 p.m. Hit start on my Garmin watch to track my pace and elevation, put in my earbuds, and headed up the trail. The first mile is steep, gaining about 1,000 feet through Douglas fir forest. And I was settling into my rhythm, breathing hard, passing a few slower hikers who stepped aside to let me by. Everything was completely normal. I remember passing a couple with a golden retriever at about the half-mile mark. I remember nodding to another trail runner coming down who warned me about muddy sections higher up. Normal interactions, normal trail traffic. At about mile 1.2, right where the trail does a sharp switchback around a boulder, I rounded the corner and everything changed. The other hikers were gone, just instantly absent. I stopped running because the silence was so abrupt and wrong. The trail looks busy from the parking lot. You can usually see people ahead of you and behind you. But suddenly, I couldn't see anyone. I turned around, looking back down the trail, and it was empty. I looked ahead, and it was empty. No voices, no footsteps, no distant conversations. Just silence. And not normal forest silence. I mean complete silence. No birds, no wind. No sound of the creek that runs parallel to the trail. Even my own breathing sounded muted, like the air itself was absorbing sound. I pulled out my earbuds, thinking maybe they were blocking something. But it was the same. Dead quiet. The light had changed too. It was darker, but not like clouds had rolled in. More like the color had drained out of everything. The greens looked gray. The brown trail looked almost black. It reminded me of old photographs. That faded quality where everything loses its vibrancy. I started running again because standing still felt worse than moving. I told myself the other hikers must have just taken different pace and I'd catch up to someone soon. But as I climbed higher, I started noticing other things that were wrong. The trail markers were there, those wooden posts with arrows and mileage, but they looked old. Not just weathered, but decades old. The paint was faded to almost nothing, the wood was grayed and cracked, and some of the posts were leaning at angles like they'd been there long enough for the ground to shift around them. I passed a bench at the mile 2 mark that I'd sat on 100 times. But it was wrong. The planks were rotted, broken, overgrown with moss. The metal brackets holding it together were rusted through. I touched it, and pieces of wood crumbled under my fingers. This bench had been fine last week. I'd sat on it. I'd taken a photo on it. Now it looked like it had been abandoned for 20 years. My heart was pounding now, and not from exertion. I checked my phone, no signal, which is normal for parts of the trail. But the time was wrong. It said 4:32 p.m. I'd been running for at least 20 minutes. I should have been at 4:50 at minimum. My watch showed 4:32 too. Both devices frozen at almost exactly when I'd started the run. I kept moving, climbing toward the ledge, because going down felt wrong somehow. Like if I turned back, I'd be committed to whatever this was. But going up, reaching the destination, felt like it might break whatever was happening. That's not logical. But nothing about this was logical. And I was operating on pure instinct. The trail surface was wrong now, too. Overgrown, with grass and small plants growing through cracks. The established packed dirt trail I knew was breaking apart, being reclaimed by the forest. I came to a section where a wooden bridge crosses a seasonal stream, and the bridge was collapsed. Not recently collapsed, old collapse, with vegetation growing through the broken planks. I had to scramble down and up the stream bank to get around it. And then I saw the sign. There's a trail sign at the 2.5-mile mark that shows distances and direction. I've passed it 1,000 times. But this version was different. Same style, same type of post. But the information was wrong. It showed mileage to places that matched, but the metal face was weathered and corroded. And at the bottom, someone had carved something into the wood. I stopped and read it, even though every instinct told me not to. It was my name, my actual name, carved deep into the wood, followed by a date. April 15th, 2044. I'm writing this in 2024. That date was 20 years in the future. And someone had carved my name below it, the letters deep and deliberate, like they'd been there for years. I ran. I don't remember making the conscious decision to run. But suddenly I was sprinting up the trail, my lungs burning, my legs screaming, not caring about pace or form or anything except getting to the top. The forest pressed in on both sides, darker now, the trees seeming to lean toward the trail. I passed another marker, same faded, ancient appearance, same wrongness. And then, the trail opened up to the ledge. Rattlesnake Ledge is a rocky outcrop that gives you a panoramic view of Rattlesnake Lake and the surrounding mountains. It's always crowded with people taking photos, sitting on the rocks, eating snacks. I burst out onto the ledge expecting to find other people, normal people, proof that I wasn't alone in whatever this was. The ledge was empty, and the view was wrong. The lake was there, but it looked different. Lower water level, different color. The highway that runs below was cracked and broken, like it hadn't been maintained in decades. Some of the buildings I could usually see were gone. Others looked collapsed. And the forest had advanced, covering areas that should have been cleared. I was looking at the same location, but aged, decayed. Like I was seeing it decades or maybe centuries after something had happened. after maintenance had stopped, after people had left or disappeared. I stood there trying to process it, and that's when I heard the sound behind me. Footsteps on the trail, slow and deliberate. Someone else was coming up to the ledge. I turned around, desperate to see another person, proof I wasn't alone. The figure that emerged from the trail was human-shaped, but wrong. It moved strangely, like it was trying to remember how walking worked. It was wearing hiking gear, jacket, pack, boots, but everything looked rotted and faded. And when it got close enough that I could see where its face should be, there was nothing. Just smooth blankness, like someone had erased its features. I backed toward the edge of the ledge, and it kept coming. Not fast, not aggressive, just persistent, getting closer. And then it spoke. And the voice came from everywhere at once, not from where its mouth should have been. "You're early?" That's when I closed my eyes. I don't know why. Some instinct that if I couldn't see this, it wouldn't be real. I squeezed my eyes shut, covered my ears like a child, and I screamed. Just let out everything, every bit of fear and confusion and horror. And I screamed until my throat was raw. When I opened my eyes, I was on the trail at mile 1.2, the exact spot where everything had changed. And it was normal. The couple with the golden retriever was there, looking at me with concern, asking if I was okay. Other hikers were visible ahead and behind. The light was normal. The sounds were back. Birds, wind, voices, the creek. Everything was exactly as it should be. I checked my watch. 4:36 p.m. 4 minutes. The entire experience, climbing almost a mile and a half, the decay, the figure, all of it. 4 minutes according to my devices. I told the couple I was fine, just dizzy for a second. And I turned around and walked back down. Not ran, walked. I was shaking too hard to run. When I got to my car, I checked the photos on my phone. I'd taken a picture of that carved sign, of my name and the future date. But when I looked at my camera roll, the photo wasn't there. Just a gap in the timestamps where it should have been. I haven't run that trail since. I drive past the turnoff sometimes, and I think about going back, about testing whether it was a one-time thing or if I could slip into that other version again. But I'm terrified of what I'd find. Terrified that the decay I saw was real, a glimpse of where we're heading. Or terrified that it's something worse, a place that exists alongside our world. And that day, I accidentally crossed over into it. The other possibility, the one that keeps me up at night, is that I didn't cross over. That for 4 minutes, our world showed me its future. That what I saw at Rattlesnake Ledge, the abandoned highways, the collapsed buildings, the forest reclaiming everything, is what's actually coming. And that carved sign with my name and a date 20 years from now wasn't a message from something else. It was proof that I'll be back there someday, on that trail in that future, and I'll carve my own name as a warning to the version of me that stumbles into that timeline today. I still run. Different trails now, always populated ones, never alone, and I never wear headphones anymore. I need to hear everything around me. Need to know if the sounds suddenly stop or if the light changes quality. Because I learned something that day that I can't unlearn. The places we think we know might not be as stable as we believe. Reality has layers, or maybe fractures. And sometimes you step wrong and fall through into something that shouldn't exist, but does. And if it happened once, it can happen again. I've cleaned a lot of toilets in my life. fixed a lot of broken water spigots, picked up trash left by careless campers, painted over graffiti on bathroom walls. It's not glamorous work, being a state park's maintenance worker. But I've done it for 23 years, and I'm good at it. I know every campground in my district, every trail junction, every quirk of the old infrastructure. I've worked holidays, weekends, night shifts. I've seen drunk campers, bear encounters, medical emergencies, proposal parties, and everything in between. In 23 years, I thought I'd seen it all. But you don't see ghosts in this job. You don't see impossible things. At least, that's what I would have told you before October of last year. Before I spent 3 weeks working night maintenance in a closed campground and learned that some places don't care whether they're officially open or not. Some places keep running their routines whether anyone living is there to witness them or not. My name is Frank. I'm 58 years old, and up until last year I described myself as a practical guy. Blue collar, no nonsense, the kind of person who fixes problems instead of overthinking them. I don't read horror novels or watch scary movies. I don't believe in the supernatural. Or I didn't anyway. Now I don't know what I believe, except that Lake Wenatchee State Park has something wrong with it. Something that plays out every night in Loop C when nobody's supposed to be watching. The campground closes after Labor Day and doesn't reopen until late spring. During the off-season, we do maintenance, repair work, painting, winterizing facilities, clearing storm damage. Usually it's day shifts. But last October we had a tight deadline to finish some projects before the first hard freeze, so they asked me to do night shifts. Work from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., check all the facilities in the closed loops, make repairs, secure anything that might get damaged in winter weather. Solo shifts, because budget cuts meant they couldn't justify 2 people for overnight maintenance. I didn't mind. I'd done solo night shifts before. The campground is peaceful when it's empty. No campers means no complaints, no emergencies, no one asking me where the nearest hiking trail is. Just me, my truck, my tools, and my checklist. Simple. The first night was completely normal. I drove through all the loops, A, B, C, and D, checking vault toilets, testing water shutoffs, looking for vandalism or storm damage. Everything was locked up tight, leaves covering the campsites, that particular stillness that empty campgrounds have. I finished my rounds by midnight, did some paperwork in my truck, and called it an early night. The second night is when it started. I was driving through Loop C around 10 p.m., my headlights cutting through the darkness, when I saw the campfire. Site 47. Right there in the middle of the loop, a fire burning in the fire ring. My first thought was that I'd missed some campers during the closing weekend, that someone was squatting illegally in a closed campground. It happens sometimes. People who don't want to pay, or who don't realize the season has ended. I parked my truck and walked toward the site. The fire was real. I could feel the heat from 20 feet away, could smell the wood smoke. But as I got closer, I noticed details that didn't add up. The fire looked fresh, like it had just been built. But there was no smoke rising from it. The flames were there, crackling and moving, but completely smokeless. And the wood. I could see the logs in the fire ring, and they weren't burning down. They just sat there, fully intact, while flames danced over them. I called out, "Hello, park's closed, you need to pack up and leave." No response. I walked around the fire ring, looking for whoever had built it, and that's when I saw the tent. It was an old canvas tent, the kind people used in the 70s or 80s, before modern nylon gear. Tan canvas, heavy-looking, with a style that hadn't been popular in decades. It was pitched perfectly, guy lines tight, positioned exactly right on the tent pad. I approached the tent, announcing myself, using my official voice. "This is park maintenance. Campground is closed. You're trespassing." Still no response. I could see the tent wall moving slightly, like someone was inside shifting around. I reached for the tent flap, ready to unzip it and deal with whoever was squatting here, when my radio crackled. My supervisor's voice. "Frank, you copy?" I stepped back from the tent and answered. He was asking about my progress, whether I'd found any major repair issues. I told him I was dealing with illegal campers in Loop C, and I'd call him back. He said to be careful and let him know if I needed backup. I turned back to the tent. It was gone. Just completely gone. The fire was gone too. I was standing in an empty campsite. Leaves undisturbed on the tent pad, no fire ring, no ashes, no sign that anyone had been there. I stood there with my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the site, trying to understand what I'd just seen. The fire ring was there. It's a permanent fixture, steel ring set in concrete, but it was cold and full of old leaves. No recent fire, no warmth. I checked the site number, Site 47. I walked the perimeter, looking for footprints or tire tracks. Nothing. The site looked like it had been empty for weeks, which it had been. We'd closed this loop over a month ago. I convinced myself I'd been mistaken, that maybe I'd seen a reflection or shadow, and my brain had filled in details that weren't there. Fatigue, maybe. I'd been working long hours. I marked the site as clear on my checklist and moved on. But the next night, I saw it again. Different site this time, Site 52 on the other side of Loop C. Same setup. Canvas tent, smokeless fire, sense of occupation, but no visible people. This time, I didn't approach it. I sat in my truck about 50 yards away and watched. The fire burned for maybe 10 minutes, steady and silent, and then it just faded out. The tent remained for a few more minutes, and then it was gone too. Not packed up, just suddenly absent, like someone had deleted it from reality. I called my supervisor the next morning and told him I was seeing things in Loop C, possible squatters or vandals who were somehow avoiding detection. He said he'd check it out during the day shift. That afternoon, he called me back and said he'd walked every site in Loop C. No sign of recent activity, no fire scars, no disturbances. He asked me if I was feeling all right, if the night shifts were getting to me. I said I was fine, but I wasn't fine. I was seeing things that disappeared, and I had no explanation. The fourth night, I decided to document it. I brought my phone with the camera ready, determined to photograph whatever I saw. Around 11 p.m., driving through Loop C, I saw another fire. Site 43 this time. I parked, grabbed my phone, and approached carefully. The fire was there, the tent was there, and this time I could hear voices. Low conversation, muffled, like people talking inside the tent. I couldn't make out words, but I could hear the rhythm of speech, the back and forth of dialogue. I raised my phone and took photos. Multiple shots of the tent, the fire, the whole site. Through my phone screen, everything looked normal. Tent, fire, occupied campsite. I took at least a dozen photos. And then I decided to try something that probably wasn't smart. I called out in a friendly voice, "Hey folks, just checking in, making sure everything's okay." The voices in the tent stopped. Complete silence. And then the tent flap opened. Not unzipped, it just suddenly fell open, like someone had released it from inside. But there was no one there. The tent was empty. I could see through the open flap into the interior, and there was no sleeping bag, no gear, no person, just empty canvas. I backed away, still holding my phone, and the fire went out. Not slowly, just extinguished instantly, like someone had thrown a bucket of water on it. But there was no steam, no hiss. Just instant darkness. The tent collapsed in on itself, the poles seeming to vanish, and within seconds there was nothing there. I ran back to my truck and checked the photos on my phone. Every single one showed an empty campsite. No tent, no fire. Just an abandoned site covered in leaves. Exactly how it should look in an off-season campground. But I had seen them. I had heard voices. My eyes hadn't deceived me. My camera had. The pattern continued for 2 more weeks. Almost every night, I'd see at least one occupied site in Loop C. Always old-style gear, canvas tents, Coleman lanterns, the kind of equipment from the 70s and 80s. Sometimes I'd see people around the fires, but they were always indistinct, shadowy. And if I tried to approach or speak to them, they'd disappear. Sometimes I'd just see the evidence of occupation, fires, tents, camp chairs set up, but no actual people. I started researching. I went to the county library on my day off and looked through old records, old newspaper archives, anything related to Lake Wenatchee State Park history. And I found something. In August 1977, a family of 4 died in a car accident leaving the campground. The Hendersons, parents and 2 kids. They'd been camping in Loop C for a week, and on their drive home, their station wagon went off the road into the Wenatchee River. All 4 died. The newspaper article included a photo of the family at their campsite the day before they left. I recognized the tent, that tan canvas tent I'd been seeing. I compared the photo to my memories. Same tent style, same setup, same type of station wagon parked beside it. The family in the photo was smiling, sitting around their campfire. No idea that less than 24 hours later, they'd all be dead. That night, I saw them. Not shadowy, not indistinct, clear as anything. Site 47, where I'd first seen the tent. The whole family sitting around the campfire. Dad was cooking something on a camp stove. Mom was reading a book in a folding chair. 2 kids, maybe 7 and 10 years old, were playing cards on a picnic table. They looked solid, real, completely ordinary, like living people. I watched from my truck for 15 minutes, and they went through what looked like normal camping routines. The dad served food on paper plates. They ate together. The kids laughed about something. It looked so normal, so alive, that I almost forgot they'd been dead for over 40 years. And then they all turned and looked directly at my truck. All 4 of them, simultaneously, turning their heads in perfect synchronization. They weren't smiling anymore. They just stared at me with expressions I can't quite describe. Not hostile, not friendly, just aware, acknowledging that I was watching them. Then they faded. Like someone was turning down their opacity in a photo editor. They just became more and more transparent until they were gone completely. The tent, the fire, the station wagon, all of it faded out together, and I was looking at an empty campsite. I requested a transfer the next day. Told my supervisor I needed to move to day shifts for personal reasons. He didn't argue. Probably figured the night shifts had gotten to me, which I guess they had. Someone else took over the overnight maintenance in Loop C. I still work for state parks, but I won't take night shifts anymore, and I won't work in Lake Wenatchee. I drive past it sometimes on the highway, and I always look toward Loop C, and I wonder if they're still there. The Henderson family, still camping, still going through the routines of that final trip, playing out their last happy memories before the accident. I wonder if they know they're dead. I wonder if they're trapped there, repeating that week over and over. Or if maybe that's what they wanted, to stay in that perfect camping trip forever, before everything ended. I don't know if they're ghosts or echoes or something else. But I know they're real, even if my photos say they're not. And I know that Loop C in Lake Wenatchee State Park is occupied every night, whether the campground is open or closed. Some reservations, I guess, don't have an expiration date. Have you ever had the feeling that something is watching you, but when you look, there's nothing there? That primitive sense that raises the hair on your arms, makes your breathing shallow? Most people experience it in cities, in parking garages, or empty streets. But I felt it at 11,000 feet, above the tree line in the Alpine Lakes wilderness, in a place so remote that I hadn't seen another human being in 3 days. And the thing watching me wasn't human. I'm not sure it was even alive in any way we'd understand. But it was intelligent, and it was patient, and it wanted me to leave its territory. My name is Janet. I'm 46 years old, and I've been backpacking solo in Washington's high country for over 20 years. I'm not reckless. I carry all the safety gear. I file trip plans. I know my limits. But I prefer hiking alone. There's a clarity you get in solitude, a kind of meditation that happens when it's just you and the mountains and silence. I've spent weeks alone in the backcountry without feeling lonely or afraid. The wilderness has always felt like home to me, like the one place where I could be completely myself. That changed last August. I don't feel welcome in the high places anymore. I don't feel like those mountains are neutral territory where humans can pass through safely if we're respectful and careful. I feel like I was tolerated before, but now I've been marked as an intruder. And I think something up there is still watching for me, still waiting to see if I'll be stupid enough to come back. I'd planned a 5-day solo trip into the Alpine Lakes wilderness, targeting a route that would take me through several high passes and along exposed ridges above tree line. My plan was to camp at alpine tarns, those small jewel-like lakes you find in the high basins, and spend my days scrambling on rock and watching marmots and taking in the kind of views that make you feel tiny and grateful at the same time. The first 2 days were perfect. Clear weather, light winds, stunning views of the Cascades stretching out in every direction. I camped at around 10,000 feet both nights, in those rocky basins where vegetation is sparse and everything is granite and ice and sky. On the third day, I climbed up to a small tarn at about 11,000 feet, right at the tree line. Below me, the forest stopped abruptly, replaced by twisted crumholts, those gnarled, wind-sculpted trees that grow at the absolute limit of where trees can survive. Above me, nothing but rock and patches of snow and alpine air so clear it felt like I could see forever. I set up my tent on a relatively flat spot about 50 yards from the water, tucked between some boulders for wind protection. It was early afternoon, plenty of time to relax, filter water, maybe do some exploring. The area was beautiful. Classic alpine terrain, that austere beauty of high elevations where everything is reduced to essentials: rock, water, sky, wind. But as I was setting up my tent, I started feeling watched. It wasn't subtle. It was that intense, focused attention that makes your skin crawl, the kind of stare you can feel even when you can't see its source. I straightened up and looked around. The basin was empty. No wildlife visible. No other hikers, just open terrain where you can see for hundreds of yards in every direction. But the feeling persisted. I looked down toward the Krumholtz Grove, that cluster of twisted trees about 100 yards below my camp. The trees were small, bent and shaped by decades of brutal wind, their branches reaching sideways instead of up. And I felt like the attention was coming from there, from the trees. I'm not a superstitious person, but I've learned to trust my instincts in the wilderness. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong, even if you can't identify the threat immediately. So I watched the trees for a while, scanning for movement, looking for bears or mountain goats or anything that might explain the feeling. Nothing. The trees stood there, motionless, twisted into their permanent wind-bent poses. I went back to setting up camp, but I kept glancing at the trees. And that's when I noticed something odd. I could swear there were more trees than before. Not dramatically more, just a few extra Krumholtz shapes that I didn't remember seeing when I'd first looked. But I hadn't counted them initially, so I couldn't be sure. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my brain was just filling in details I hadn't processed the first time. By evening, the feeling of being watched had intensified. I ate dinner outside my tent, boiling water for my dehydrated meal, and the whole time I felt eyes on me. I kept looking at the Krumholtz grove, and every time I did, I felt more certain that there were additional trees. The grove looked denser, the spacing between individual trees narrower. I actually got out my phone and took a photo of the trees, thinking I could compare it to mental images and verify whether I was crazy or not. That night, I barely slept. The wind picked up around midnight, which is normal at high elevation. But underneath the wind, I kept hearing other sounds. Creaking, like wood bending under stress. Rustling, like branches scraping together. And something that sounded almost like footsteps. Slow, heavy impacts, but irregular, not matching any walking rhythm I recognized. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made me sit bolt upright in my sleeping bag. It sounded like roots moving through soil. That distinctive sound of organic matter being displaced, of things growing or shifting underground. I lay there in my tent, listening, and I swear I could feel vibrations through the ground. Subtle, but definitely there. When dawn came, I unzipped my tent to find something that made my stomach drop. The Krumholtz grove was closer. Not subtly closer, obviously, undeniably closer. Trees that had been 100 yards away were now maybe 60 yards from my tent. And there were more of them. The grove had expanded, filled in, densified. What had been a scattered cluster of maybe 20 trees was now a grove of 50 or more, and they formed an arc around my campsite. I got out of the tent and stood there in the cold morning air, staring at the trees, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe I'd misjudged the distance the day before. Maybe the angle of light was different, and that made them look closer. Maybe I was experiencing some kind of altitude-induced confusion. But even as I tried these explanations, I knew they were wrong. The trees had moved. They had advanced toward me overnight. I walked toward the grove, needing to see it up close, to verify that these were real trees and not some hallucination. As I got within maybe 20 feet, the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. Not just watched, examined, assessed, like something was studying me with intense focus, trying to understand what I was. The trees themselves looked ancient. Their bark was rough and weathered, scarred by decades of wind and ice. Their branches twisted in impossible directions, some of them seeming to reach specifically toward my campsite. And at the base of several trees, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The soil was disturbed. Fresh disturbance, like something had been digging or pushing up from below. And the roots. I could see roots on the surface that hadn't broken through the thin alpine soil yet. Thick roots that looked like they were still extending, still growing. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the trees, and returned to my tent. I checked the photo I'd taken the previous evening, and when I compared it to what I was seeing now, the difference was unmistakable. The grove had been smaller, farther away, less dense. In less than 12 hours, it had grown and moved significantly. I decided right then that I was leaving. I didn't care if it was irrational, didn't care if there was some logical explanation I was missing. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from those trees. I started packing my gear, working quickly, and as I did, I kept glancing at the crumholes. And every time I looked away and then looked back, the trees seemed slightly closer. I started testing it deliberately. I'd stare at one specific tree, memorizing its position relative to a boulder or a patch of snow. Then I'd look away for 10 seconds and look back. The tree had moved. Not far, maybe a foot or two, but definitely moved. Closer to me. When I stared directly at them, they were still. But the moment my attention shifted, they advanced. The packing took me about 20 minutes, and by the time I was ready to leave, the grove had advanced to within 30 yards of my tent. I could see individual branches clearly now, could see the way they seemed to orient toward me. Some of the trees had branches that hung down like arms, and others had formations in their trunks that looked almost like faces, knots and scars arranged in patterns that suggested eyes and mouths. I shouldered my pack and started hiking, heading up toward the ridge above tree line, away from the grove. And I heard it then, clearly and undeniably. The sound of movement behind me. Scraping, creaking, the sound of wood in motion. I turned around and saw the trees at the edge of the grove swaying, leaning, bending toward the path I'd taken. Not wind movement, deliberate movement, like they were reaching for where I'd been. I climbed faster, scrambling up the rocky slope toward the exposed ridge above. My plan was to stay above tree line, on open rock where trees couldn't follow, and circle around to a different descent route. It meant adding an entire day to my hike out. But I didn't care. I wasn't going to hike back down through forest, wasn't going to put myself in a position where trees could surround me. As I climbed higher, I kept looking back at my campsite. The grove had moved to exactly where my tent had been. The trees clustered in that spot, filling it completely, and they seemed to be orienting outward, watching the ridge where I was climbing. I took photos, dozens of them, documenting what I was seeing because I knew no one would believe me otherwise. I spent that night on bare rock at 12,000 feet, above any possible tree growth, shivering in my sleeping bag because it was too windy to set up my tent properly. But I felt safer on that exposed ridge than I had at the tarn. At least up there I could see in all directions. Nothing could approach without me knowing. The next morning, I hiked out via a different route, staying high on exposed ridges until I absolutely had to descend into forest. When I finally did drop below tree line, I practically ran through the woods, not stopping until I reached the trailhead and my car. Back home, I reviewed all my photos. The progression is clear and undeniable. Time-stamped images showing the grove expanding, advancing, surrounding my campsite. I showed them to a botanist friend, asking if there was any explanation for what appeared to be trees moving position. She looked at the photos for a long time before saying, very carefully, that there was no botanical explanation for what the images showed. I haven't been back to the Alpine Lakes wilderness. I haven't done any solo backpacking since then. The wilderness doesn't feel safe to me anymore, doesn't feel neutral. I keep thinking about those trees, about the intelligence behind their movement. They weren't attacking me. They were enclosing me, surrounding me, cutting off my escape routes. It felt methodical, strategic. It felt like something was using the trees, or maybe something was the trees, and it was defending its territory against an intruder. I wonder how many other people have experienced something similar and just never talked about it. How many unexplained disappearances in the high country might be connected to places like that tarn, to groves that move and watch and encircle? How many hikers never came back because they camped in the wrong spot, at the wrong elevation, and something at the tree line decided they weren't welcome? I still have dreams about those twisted trees, about waking up to find them pressed against my tent. Branches scratching at the fabric, roots pushing up under my sleeping pad. And sometimes, when I'm hiking in lower elevation forests, on popular trails surrounded by other people, I'll feel that same sensation of being watched. I'll look at the trees around me, ordinary pines and firs, and I'll wonder if they're watching too. If they're aware. If tree line isn't a botanical boundary but a border, a territory marker, and I crossed it without permission. The mountains are still beautiful. I still miss the high country, miss that clarity and silence. But I learned something I can't unlearn. We're not alone up there. The wilderness has its own residents, its own intelligence, and it doesn't need us. Maybe it even wants us gone. And next time I ignore that feeling of being watched, next time I camp somewhere that feels wrong, the trees might not let me leave at all. We were 4 friends who thought we knew what we were doing. We'd all been backcountry skiing together for years, had taken avalanche safety courses, knew how to read terrain and assess snowpack. We weren't reckless kids. We were experienced, careful, respectful of the mountains. But experience doesn't matter when you enter territory that something else considers its own. And all the avalanche beacons and safety gear in the world won't protect you from something that hunts deliberately, intelligently, with a patience that suggests it's been doing this for a very long time. I'm the one telling this story because I'm the only one who can. Marcus is dead. Jen won't talk about it at all. She's completely shut down, refused therapy, cut off contact with everyone from that trip. And Kyle moved to Arizona and told me he'll never see snow again as long as he lives. As for me, I still live in Seattle, but I sold all my backcountry gear. I can't even look at ski equipment without feeling that cold terror settle into my chest, that certainty that something is standing just behind me, breathing, waiting. It was early February, peak backcountry season, and we'd rented a cabin deep in the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. The kind of place that's only accessible in winter if you ski in, about 4 miles from the nearest plowed road, completely isolated. Fresh powder had fallen all the week, and the conditions were perfect. We loaded up our packs with food, fuel, and gear for 3 days, and we skied in on a Friday afternoon, reaching the cabin just as the light was failing. The cabin was old, but well-maintained, with a wood stove, propane for cooking, and sleeping lofts for 4 people. We got a fire going, cooked dinner, and sat around planning the next day's routes. We were all excited. The snowpack seemed stable, the weather was clear, and we had this perfect powder waiting for us. We drank whiskey, told stupid stories, and eventually went to sleep, feeling like we had the mountains to ourselves. The first hint that something was wrong came the next morning. Kyle woke up early and went outside to check the weather. And when he came back in, he looked confused. He said there were tracks around the cabin. Large tracks, bipedal, circling the entire structure. We all went out to look, and he was right. Something had walked a complete circle around the cabin, maybe 20 feet out from the walls. The tracks were huge, easily twice the size of a human footprint, and the stride length was wrong. Too long, with a gait that suggested something with legs longer than they should be. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear, waking early from hibernation? But bears don't walk on two legs for that distance, don't make that kind of track pattern. Maybe someone else was out here, wearing snowshoes? But these weren't snowshoe tracks, and the depth suggested something heavy, something that sank into the powder with considerable weight. Marcus wanted to follow the tracks, see where they led. Jen and I thought we should just ignore them, get on with our planned ski routes. Kyle took photos, documenting the tracks and their measurements. We eventually decided to stick with our original plan. We'd be back at the cabin by afternoon anyway, and we'd keep an eye out for whatever had made the tracks. We spent the day skiing fresh powder, dropping into bowls and riding perfect snow, and it was everything we'd hoped for. But several times during the day, I had that feeling of being watched, that primitive sense that raises every alarm your body has. I'd stop and scan the tree line, the ridges above us, looking for movement or shapes that didn't belong. I never saw anything definitive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We got back to the cabin around 4 p.m., exhausted and satisfied, ready for food and warmth. But as we approached, we saw more tracks. Different ones this time, fresh in the snow we'd broken trail through that morning. These tracks came from the forest, approached the cabin, circled it again, tighter this time. Maybe 10 feet from the walls, and then continued into the trees on the other side. Inside the cabin, everything looked normal. Nothing disturbed, no signs of entry. But the atmosphere felt different, charged somehow. We locked both doors, which we hadn't bothered to do the night before, and we started dinner with an unspoken tension that hadn't been there before. Around 8 p.m., we heard it for the first time. Footsteps on the porch, heavy, deliberate, the sound of weight on wooden planks. We all froze, listening. The footsteps moved from one end of the porch to the other, then back, then silence. Kyle grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, shining it out onto the porch. Nothing there. No tracks in the fresh snow on the porch, no disturbance. But we'd all heard it. An hour later, it came back. Footsteps again, heavier this time, and then something else. Scratching on the door. Not frantic scratching, not like an animal trying to get in. Deliberate scratching, like something was testing the door, checking its strength. Jen called out, "Who's there?" And the scratching stopped immediately. Complete silence. We waited, barely breathing, and then we heard breathing from just outside the door. Deep, wet breathing, like something with fluid in its lungs or throat. Marcus grabbed the poker from the wood stove and positioned himself by the door. He called out, trying to sound authoritative. "We're armed. We'll defend ourselves if we have to." The breathing continued for another minute, and then we heard movement. Whatever it was had left the porch and was walking around the cabin. We could track its progress by sound. Footsteps in the snow, circling the structure. At each window it stopped, and we could hear breathing against the glass. Kyle had his phone out, trying to get a signal to call for help. But there was no service. We were 4 miles from the nearest road, in the middle of a winter night, with something outside that clearly knew we were in here and clearly wasn't leaving. We stoked the fire higher, turned on all the lanterns, and agreed that we'd take shifts staying awake, watching the doors and windows. Around midnight, during Marcus's watch, he woke us all up. He'd heard voices outside the cabin, calling our names. He said he'd heard his girlfriend's voice, clear as anything, calling, "Marcus, help me, I'm lost." But his girlfriend was in Seattle. Then we all heard it, Jen's mother's voice calling, "Jennifer, please open the door. It's cold out here." Jen's mother lived in Portland and had never been to this cabin. The voices continued for over an hour, voices of people we knew, people we loved, calling to us, begging us to open the door, to come outside, to help them. The voices were perfect, exact replicas of tone and inflection, with emotional details that felt real. My own sister's voice called to me, using a nickname only she used, begging me to let her in. But my sister was in California, and there was no possible way she could be here. We didn't open the door. We held it together, reminding each other that it was a trick, that something was trying to create confusion, to lure us outside. But it was hard. You can't imagine how hard it is to hear someone you love begging for help and not respond, even when you know rationally that it can't be real. Around 3 a.m., the voices stopped and were replaced by a new sound. Something was on the roof. Heavy movement, walking back and forth on the metal roof, the sound echoing through the cabin. It would walk from one end to the other, stop, and then walk back, over and over, for hours. None of us slept. We sat together in the main room, keeping the fire going, and we waited for dawn. When the first light finally came around 6:30, the sound stopped. We waited another hour, and then Marcus said he was going to check outside, see if there were tracks, see if we could identify what had been harassing us all night. Jen and I told him to wait, to let it be full daylight. But he was angry now, frustrated, needed to confront whatever this was. He grabbed his ski pole as a weapon and went outside. Kyle and I followed, staying close. The area around the cabin was covered in tracks, dozens of them, overlapping, circling, leading to and from the tree line. And there were marks on the door, deep gouges in the wood that looked like claw marks. We decided to leave immediately, to ski out before nightfall, to get back to civilization and safety. We packed quickly, loaded our gear, and set out on our ski trail back toward the road. The skiing was harder than it had been coming in. The trail we'd broken was partially filled with new snow, and we were exhausted and frightened and not thinking clearly. About 2 miles from the cabin, Marcus stopped. He was at the back of our group, and when we turned around to see why he'd stopped, he was staring into the forest. He said quietly, "It's following us." We looked where he was pointing, and through the trees, we could see movement. Something large, keeping pace with us, staying maybe 50 yards into the forest, but matching our speed. We skied faster. The thing in the forest kept up easily. We could hear it now, crashing through the undergrowth, breaking branches, and we could occasionally catch glimpses. Something tall, dark, moving on 2 legs, but wrong. Proportions that didn't match human anatomy. We were maybe a mile from the trailhead when Marcus's binding broke. Just snapped, the mechanism failing catastrophically. He tried to fix it, hands shaking, but it was beyond field repair. He'd have to walk the rest of the way in his ski boots, which meant moving much slower. The thing in the forest had stopped when we stopped. We could sense it waiting, watching. Marcus told us to go ahead, to ski out and send help back. We refused. We weren't splitting up. Jen gave Marcus her ski poles to use as walking sticks, and we started moving again. Slower now, with Marcus post-holing through deep snow in his boots. The thing stayed with us, pacing us, sometimes visible through the trees, sometimes just a presence we could feel. And then it did something that still makes me cold to think about. It started calling to us in our own voices. I heard my voice, coming from the forest, saying, "Wait for me, I'm right behind you." Kyle heard his voice saying, "I need help over here." We'd call out to each other to verify who was speaking, to make sure we were all together, and the thing would mimic our responses. When we finally reached the trailhead and got to our car, we were hypothermic, exhausted, and traumatized. We threw our gear in the vehicle and drove without stopping until we hit a town with a hospital. That's where we learned that Marcus had severe frostbite on his feet from that walk. He'd been moving through snow for over 2 hours in ski boots that weren't meant for walking, and the damage was extensive. He died 3 weeks later. The frostbite had been too severe, infection set in despite treatment, and he developed sepsis. The doctors said if we'd gotten him to care sooner, if he hadn't had to walk that mile, he might have survived. So that's on me, on all of us. We should have left the first night when we saw those tracks. We should have skied out at first light instead of waiting. We should have done a dozen things differently, and Marcus would still be alive. I don't know what was out there. The sheriff's department investigated, but they found only our tracks and some indeterminate marks they attributed to wildlife. They treated it as a tragic accident, equipment failure, and poor judgment leading to exposure. They didn't want to hear about the thing that followed us, the voices, the intelligence behind it all. But I know what I experienced. Something lives in those mountains that understands humans well enough to mimic us, to use our voices and our relationships against us. Something territorial and patient and cruel. And I think it let us leave. I think it could have taken all of us if it wanted to. But it chose to let 3 of us go and take 1. Sometimes I wonder if it's still waiting up there, still circling that cabin at night, still calling out in voices of people we love. And I wonder how many other backcountry cabins have their own watchers, their own things that circle and call and wait for someone to make a mistake and come outside. Marcus was my friend, and he's gone because of a decision I could have fought harder against. I live with that. But I also live with the knowledge that there are places in these mountains where we're not welcome, where something else has claimed the territory. And if we ignore the warnings, the tracks, the feeling of being watched, the sounds in the night, we do so at our own peril. The mountains are beautiful, but they're not empty, and they're not safe. I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible. I need you to listen to the whole thing before you decide I'm crazy or lying. Because what I'm about to describe ended my 15-year career with the National Park Service and changed everything I thought I understood about the places we call wilderness. I was a ranger. I was trained to observe, document, and report. I believed in evidence, in procedure, in rational explanations for natural phenomena. But there are some things that can't be rationalized, and some reports that can never be filed officially because no one would believe them. This is mine. My name is David Chen, and until 6 months ago, I was a backcountry ranger for Olympic National Park. I patrolled the coastal wilderness section, one of the most remote and beautiful stretches of coastline in the lower 48. Miles of rugged beach, temperate rainforest coming right down to the ocean, sea stacks rising from the surf, and an isolation that feels prehistoric. During the off-season, you can patrol for days without seeing another human being. It's the kind of place where nature feels dominant and humanity feels like a temporary visitor. I loved that job. I loved the solitude, the responsibility, the feeling of being a guardian for something larger than myself. I took my duties seriously, checking on backcountry campers, monitoring wildlife, assessing storm damage, enforcing regulations, and most importantly, keeping detailed logs of everything I observed. Documentation is crucial in Park Service work. If you see something unusual, you write it down. If you find something that needs investigation, you photograph it and file a report. Everything goes on record. But there are some things you can't put in an official report. Some things that, when you try to describe them, make you sound unhinged. Some things that your superiors will dismiss or explain away, because accepting them would mean accepting that our understanding of reality is incomplete. Last November, I was doing a solo patrol along a remote section of the coastal wilderness. It was off-season. The weather was typical for November, cold, drizzly, gray. And I wasn't expecting to encounter anyone. The area I was checking was officially closed to camping. An isolated stretch where we'd been having erosion issues and wanted to limit human impact while we assessed stability. I was hiking along the beach in the late afternoon, around 4 p.m., when I saw the structures. At first, from a distance, I thought maybe illegal campers had set up despite the closure. But as I got closer, I realized these weren't modern tents or tarps. These were shelters made from driftwood and what looked like woven cedar bark. Sophisticated construction, the kind that requires skill and time. There were 3 of them, arranged in a small cluster just above the high tide line. I approached cautiously, calling out to announce my presence, ready to explain that this was a closed area and whoever had built these would need to dismantle them and move on. But no one responded. The shelters appeared occupied. There was smoke rising from one, though I couldn't see a fire. There were tools laid out on a flat rock, implements made of carved wood and what looked like bone or antler. There was fish laid out to dry on a rack made of branches. Everything suggested recent, active habitation. But I couldn't find the people. I called out multiple times, identified myself as a park ranger, and got no response. I checked around the area, looking for whoever had built this camp. And that's when I started noticing details that didn't make sense. The tools were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of crude or improvised, wrong in the sense of unfamiliar. I've seen plenty of traditional Native American tools and construction techniques through my work with tribal cultural resources staff. These were similar, but different. The designs were close, but off, like someone had remembered the general idea, but changed the specific execution. The proportions were odd. The materials were unusual combinations. And there were decorative elements carved into the wood that I didn't recognize from any tradition I knew. The fish on the drying rack were fresh, maybe hours old. But there were no boats, no fishing gear, no tracks leading to or from the water. The sand around the shelters was smooth, undisturbed except for my own footprints. I pulled out my camera and started documenting everything, taking detailed photos for my report. This was clearly a violation of park regulations, building structures in a closed area. But it was also potentially a cultural resources issue, something that might need consultation with tribal authorities. I took measurements, noted GPS coordinates, and prepared to radio in my findings. That's when I checked my previous patrol photos. I had been through this exact stretch of beach 2 weeks earlier, doing the same routine patrol. I had photos from that patrol, time-stamped and GPS tagged, showing this beach. And in those photos, the beach was empty. No structures, no sign of any human presence. So either someone had built this entire camp in the last 2 weeks, in November, in terrible weather, in a closed area, or something else was going on. The level of construction I was seeing should have taken weeks, maybe months. The shelters were substantial, well-crafted, showing signs of weathering and use. They looked like they'd been there for a season at least, not 2 weeks. I examined the fire pit more closely. There were embers glowing, heat radiating from the stones. But there was no smoke, no fuel that I could see, and no ash. Just heat coming from rocks arranged in a circle, with nothing burning. And I held my hand near it. Definitely warm, definitely real heat, but no visible source. The food on the drying rack was the same type of fish we saw in these waters. Nothing exotic. But when I looked closely at the cutting marks, at the way the fish had been prepared, the technique was precise and unfamiliar. Every fillet was identical, cut with a precision that suggested tools sharper than the implements I could see. I spent about 30 minutes documenting the sight, and during that time, I had a growing sense of wrongness, the kind of feeling you get when you're somewhere you shouldn't be, when you're intruding on something private or sacred. The air felt heavy, charged, like before a thunderstorm, and I felt watched, intensely watched, from multiple directions at once. I decided to set up a trail camera, one of the motion-activated cameras we use to monitor wildlife. I positioned it to capture the entrance to the camp, figuring it would either record the people returning or prove that the site was abandoned. Then I hiked another mile down the beach to continue my patrol, planning to check the camera on my return the next day. That night, I camped several miles away at an established ranger station. I filed my preliminary report via radio, describing the structures and their unusual nature, requesting guidance on how to proceed. My supervisor said he'd check with cultural resources staff and get back to me. The next morning, I hiked back to the site. I was prepared to encounter whoever had built the camp, to have a conversation about regulations and closures, maybe to learn about what cultural practices I was observing. The camp was gone. Completely gone. I stood on the exact GPS coordinates I'd marked, looking at smooth, empty beach. No structures, no tools, no fire pit, no drying racks. Nothing. Just sand and driftwood scattered naturally by tides, like no one had ever been there. I walked the area in expanding circles, thinking maybe I'd somehow gotten the wrong spot. But my GPS was accurate, my landmarks were correct. This was the exact location. I could see my own boot prints from the day before, my path around the site where I'd taken photos. But the camp itself was gone without a trace. I checked my camera. It was still there, mounted where I'd left it. But when I reviewed the footage, my hands started shaking. The timestamp showed approximately 4 hours of recording after I'd left the previous day. For the first hour, nothing. Just an empty beach with my footprints visible. Then, at around 6 p.m., figures appeared on the camera. They walked into frame from the direction of the ocean, not from the forest. Just suddenly present, coming from the water, though I could see no boat or raft. There were 7 of them, and they were humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, proportions that didn't match human anatomy. Their movements were fluid but strange, like they weren't subject to normal physics or gravity. They went to exactly where the camp had been, where empty beach now appeared to be, and they moved through routines as if the structures were still there. They bent down as if entering shelters. They reached out as if handling tools. They sat in positions that would make sense around a fire. But the camera showed them interacting with nothing. Miming activities in empty space. And then, around 7:30 p.m. on the recording. One of them turned and looked directly at the camera. The others all turned in synchronization, all facing the camera, and even through the grainy night vision footage. I could see their faces. They weren't human faces. The proportions were wrong, eyes too wide set, mouths that extended too far across the face, features that were almost human, but fundamentally other. And they were looking at the camera with clear awareness, clear intelligence. They knew they were being recorded. The tallest one walked toward the camera, getting closer and closer until its face filled the frame. And then it reached out, and the footage distorted, pixelated, went to static. When the image cleared again, seconds later, all the figures were gone. The beach was empty for the remaining hours of recording. I took the camera back to the station and showed my supervisor. I showed him my photos from the day before, showing the structures. I showed him the footage of the figures. And I watched his expression change from interest to concern to something like pity. He suggested I take some time off, that the isolation of solo patrols can affect people, that what I'd experienced might be a stress response or fatigue-induced hallucination. I insisted the evidence was right there, documented, recorded. He gently pointed out that my photos showed structures that demonstrably didn't exist, and my camera footage showed figures that couldn't be human. Over the next week, I tried to get someone to take my report seriously. I contacted cultural resources, thinking maybe this was some unknown tribal site or spiritual practice. They reviewed my materials and said they had no record of any tribes using that specific area in that way, and that the designs I documented didn't match any known Pacific Northwest indigenous patterns. I contacted wildlife biology staff, wondering if somehow I'd encountered an unknown species or misidentified something. They watched the footage and had no explanation. One biologist told me off the record that several coastal areas in Olympic National Park had similar reports over the years, sightings and encounters that didn't fit known wildlife or human activity, but nothing that had ever been officially investigated. I went back to that beach one more time, without telling anyone, without official authorization. I needed to see it again, to verify that I wasn't losing my mind. It was empty, exactly as it should be. Clean sand, normal driftwood scatter, no evidence of any structures or habitation. But when I stood there in the exact spot where the camp had been, I felt it again. That sense of being watched, of trespassing, of being seen by something that existed just outside my normal perception. And then I heard something that made me leave and never come back. Voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Not from the forest, not from the ocean, but from right there on the beach, surrounding me, though I could see no one. The voices were having a conversation, overlapping. And though I couldn't understand the words, the tone was clear. Assessment, discussion, decision. Like they were deciding what to do about me. I walked away calmly, not running, not looking back. And I kept walking until I reached my vehicle. I drove back to headquarters and submitted my resignation effective immediately. No explanation, no formal reason, just a resignation. My supervisor accepted it without question, probably relieved. I don't work for the Park Service anymore. I don't patrol those beaches, don't document anomalies, don't file reports. But I kept copies of everything, the photos, the camera footage, my detailed notes. I keep them as proof for myself, if nothing else. Proof that I saw something real, something that exists in a space adjacent to our reality. I think there are places where our world overlaps with somewhere else. Places where boundaries are thin, where other realities bleed through. and I think that beach is one of them. I think what I saw was a glimpse of inhabitants from that other place, going about their lives in their version of that space. And for a brief time, the overlap was strong enough that I could see their structures, their tools, their presence. The footage of those figures still haunts me. The way they moved, the way they looked at the camera with complete awareness. They weren't surprised to be seen. They weren't afraid of being documented. They just acknowledged my presence the way you might acknowledge a curious animal, with mild interest and no concern. I wonder how many other rangers have seen similar things and been told they were mistaken or suffering from isolation effects. I wonder how many reports have been dismissed or explained away, because accepting them would mean accepting that our parks, our wilderness areas, contain things we don't understand and can't control. Olympic National Park is still beautiful. The coastal wilderness is still one of the most stunning places in America. But it's not empty, and it's not fully ours. There are others there, in spaces we can sometimes glimpse, but never fully enter. And they've been there far longer than we have. That's my last report. The one I couldn't file officially. The one that cost me my career, but gave me a truth I can't ignore. We share this world with things we don't see, in places that exist alongside our reality. And sometimes, if conditions are right, the boundaries dissolve, and we catch a glimpse of what's always been there, just out of sight. I don't go to Olympic anymore. I don't patrol beaches or document anomalies. But I remember those figures turning to look at the camera. And I remember that sense of being assessed by an intelligence that predates human presence in these forests. And I know that those structures will appear again, to someone else. And maybe that person will be brave enough or foolish enough to stay longer than I did. I hope they're careful. I hope they understand that some doors, once opened, change you permanently. And I hope they remember that being a guest means respecting the territory of others, even when those others exist in dimensions we can barely perceive. The wilderness isn't empty. It never has been. We just can't always see what's there.